This is Josh from Canby. I am just wanting to give you the Greek rundown for my sermon that's coming up on Ephesians 5:18 through 6:9. This sermon is going to be September 10th. So if you want to see the sermon that goes with this Greek, I will try to put a link to that. But I want to walk through Ephesians 5:18 through 6:9 because the grammar here is actually quite interesting and it changes the meaning from what we read in normal translations. This is one of those situations where the Greek is very entangled. By that I mean that a lot of the verbs depend on other verbs. In English, we don't tend to say things in the same way that they say in Greek. In Greek, participles, which you'll see that these verbs here, P, AP, if the middle letter's a P, these are all participles. So these participles all depend on the noun, or on the verb above it, on the finite verb. So what we're going to do is explore how this affects the meaning in Ephesians 5:18 through 6:9. So let's jump right in. The operative thing is that there's a command in 5:18 to not be drunk with wine, but to be filled with the Spirit. And then there follow a whole bunch of participles that are dependent on that be filled. So the participle is speaking and singing and making melody and giving thanks and submitting. Now, the way that you'll have this in a normal English translation is going to not talk about these words in a way that you can tell that they're relying on the first be filled, because the translators don't want to make a judgment call on what the nature of the relationship between these verbs are. On the other hand, because I know what I'm trying to communicate from the sermon, for the purposes of my sermon, it's totally appropriate to do the work to say what is the best relationship between these verbs and the head verb. And so what I've decided is that this is what's called a result participle. So you can translate all of these verbs as being a result of the head verb. So we can say that the speaking in Psalms is a result of being filled with the Spirit. We can see that. We can understand how being filled with the Spirit will lead us to speak in psalms and hymns and spiritual songs. Singing is a result of being filled with the Spirit. Making melody in your heart to the Lord is a result of being filled with the Spirit. Giving thanks always for all things in the name of our Lord Jesus Christ to God, even the Father, is a result of being filled with the Spirit. And finally, the attitude of submitting to one another in the fear of Christ, the women each to their own man as to the Lord, is a result of being filled with the Spirit. Now, the way we read these in our English translations is that verse 22 just says, women submit to your husbands as to the Lord. But what we understand when we look at the Greek is that this is all a result of the filling of the Spirit. Now, this doesn't mean that Paul is not commanding women to submit to their husbands. It's clear that he is later in the passage. But what is valuable to me to understand here is that these are all results of a different command. The command is be filled with the Spirit. As we scroll down, we'll notice something similar again. When we look at the next section, men love your women, just as Christ loved the church and gave himself for her in order that he might sanctify her by cleansing her by the washing of the word, in order that he might present to himself the glorified church, not having spot nor wrinkle nor any such like, but in order that she might be holy and blameless. This is all in the context of loving women. Everything else is dependent on that head idea. And so what he does later is he talks about this is about the relationship of Christ and the church that I'm speaking, not men and women. So as we see, yes, men love your women just as Christ loved the church. It is a command for men to love their women. But in a large part, this whole middle part is theology. It's Christological theology about the relationship of Christ and the church. So as we continue down, you see here is a true, command. It's not a command form of a verb, but it says ophtelusin. The men owe it to the women to love them as their own bodies. So this is a direct command in the sense that Paul has actually put in a word saying what has to be done. So I think that when you look at some of these commands that you've heard, like women have to submit to their husbands, that's not a specific point that Paul is pulling out, whereas men owe it to their women to love them That is a specific command that he's pulling out. And then he continues without making more commands until he gets to here. In verse 33, we have more of those commands, those imperatives. And this is where you actually have a command to the men and a command to the women. Each single husband among you must love his own wife as himself, and the man must respect the husband. It's interesting here that we have the word phobetai, the word for fear, which we've translated respect. That's the normal way that translators translate it. But this word, it doesn't show up just here in the passage. When we look up, we see that that word shows up. Fear of Christ is how we are to submit to one another. And then we see it again when we're talking about slaves and masters, which is on the last page here. In verse 5, slaves are to obey their masters with fear and trembling. So we have that fear word coming up a few times in this, used in different ways, sort of. Fear and trembling is a little beyond what we think of as respect. But I think it's clear that Paul, besides giving commands to how men and women are to relate, is talking to us deeply about how the church is to relate to Christ, with fear and respect and trembling, submitting to Christ. Finally, I want to make out just one or two more opinions. One is that when he talks about women, he uses the word for submit, hupotasso. But when he talks about children and slaves, he uses hupakuete, which is mind, or listen to, or obey. So I don't think there's a huge significant difference there, but I do find it interesting that he's chosen to use a different word when he's talking about those. And finally, the last observation that I want to make is that when you look at this last section on slaves from chapter 6:5 to chapter 6:9, the thing that I find most interesting is tahauta. And this is visible in the English as well. But he says, the same. Do the same to your slaves that they are to do to you. Now that's very strange because we wouldn't think that in a vertical relationship, the way that the slave is supposed to submit to the master is the same way that the master is supposed to submit to the slave. So I don't think that the point is that the master should fear and tremble with respect to the slave. But the section on the slave focuses so much on being the slave of Christ. Not doing things for our human masters, but doing our things for God by being a slave to the Lord and not to men, because we know that each person, whatever good thing he does, this he will receive from the Lord, whether slave or free man. So as we end this, we remember that even if we are in a vertical relationship over somebody, the Lord of us is the Lord of them, and the Lord of them is the Lord of us, so that we, even when we are lords over people, have to remember that we both serve a Lord in heaven. Thank you. That's my quick grammatical overview from the passage of Ephesians 5:18, 6 through 9, or 18 through 6:9. And I hope that you enjoyed this. And once again, there's a link to the video of the sermon that I will be refreshing as soon as we get that sermon posted. Thanks very much. Have a great day.